So, hello everyone. Welcome to our third technical session. We've got guys tuning in from all over Asia. We've got currently 42 people signed up at the moment. So we're broadcasting to Vietnam, Philippines, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. So a great spread of people from all over the region.
Nice.
Yeah. So that those of you who don't know me, my name is Charles. I run the Brew conference, the Southeast Asia Brewers conference, and also this year or last year we launched our Brewers technical sessions. So we had great plans for this year to run 8 sessions throughout the region. Unfortunately, circumstances have dictated otherwise, and so we've had to go virtual as opposed to be with you in real life. But we're hoping later this year we'll be able to reschedule some of those sessions and come and visit you in your own countries with specialists and technicians from some of the supply companies. So we're putting together this series of webinars. We've run 2 so far, which is more on the business side of brewing, of how to survive this current crisis. What we're going to be doing now is we're going to be focusing more on some technical aspects of brewing. So today we have John Palmer with us. He is going to be presenting on water and adjusting water for your different brewing styles. And next week we're going to be working with fermenters to produce a yeast seminar. So that will be next Thursday. But today we're with John Palmer. A quick spot of housekeeping before we get going. I'll be introducing John in a moment. He's going to present for about 35 minutes. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session in which you can ask all your questions. If you do have questions, you'll notice you can't talk during the webinar. So please hold on to your questions and then pop them into the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little Q&A icon. Just feel free, put your questions in there, and then we'll pose those to John once he's finished his presentation. This webinar is also going to be recorded, so it will be available for playback once we've downloaded the audio files and set it up onto the Brew website. So you'll be able to find it at www.c-brew.com, which is our Brew website. So now that housekeeping is done, let me introduce John Palmer to you. Most of you probably know him anyway. He joined us at Brew 2 years ago in the Philippines, and
right.
was very popular as a brewing icon. Just a bit of background on John. He's a best-selling author of How to Brew and also a co-author of Water, a comprehensive guide for brewers. He also co-hosts a popular brewing broadcast called Brew Strong. And he was a metallurgical engineer by training and spent 25 years in aerospace before the lure of the brewing process pulled him away. And that's when he came and joined us. So John also runs his own consulting company, Palmer Brewing Solutions, and is the publications director for the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. And he's spoken at brewing conferences and judged beer all over the world. So today he's going to present to us on water. So over to you, John.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Charles, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And even though I can't see everyone out there in the Southeast Asia, it's a real pleasure to be talking with you all again. I'm going to share my screen here in a minute, and I'll lead you through adjusting water for style, as well as touching on some aspects of brewing with reverse osmosis water, because I knew that came up in some of the initial questions. So here we go. See about sharing my screen here. Okay, can you see that? Okay, can you see it, Charles? Yep, okay. All right, so let's put water in perspective. We're talking about adjusting water for beer style and how we do that. And how do I advance this? There we go. Okay. Oh, I want to mention that I have my own water app available for phones, both the iPhone and Galaxy, Google. You can go to the Apple Store or the Google Play Store. And this app works just like my spreadsheet. It walks you through how to input your source water data and the type of beer that you wish to brew, and it'll give you suggestions for ion concentrations, help you do salt additions and acid additions, and then give you a final display of your water profile compared to the suggestions. So very handy app, it's free, so I encourage you to download it and check it out. So why do we adjust brewing water? Well, we do it mainly to improve beer yield. We also do it to improve beer flavor. And what do we adjust? We adjust the mineral composition of the water. How do we adjust it? Well, we do that by salt additions, acid additions, and ion removal processes such as reverse osmosis. So my top 5 list for brewing great beer, top 5 ways to do that. Number 1, sanitize everything. Number 2, plenty of clean, healthy yeast. Number 3, control the fermentation temperature. Number 4 is to have a sufficient boil, okay? And the reason I say a sufficient boil is because when we make our wort, we really are cooking that wort. We're cooking it with the hops. We're developing flavors that will later be realized after fermentation in the beer. So a sufficient amount of boil and cooking of our wort is very much a part of our beer flavors. Okay, number 5, a good recipe. A good recipe is all about proportions, not going overboard on the specialty malts, and so on. And lastly, number 6 is water adjustment. And this is where water adjustment really fits into the grand scheme of things. It's last. Okay, you've got to get everything else done first. You've got to have good sanitation, because that's number 1. You've got to have a great fermentation. The good fermentation of a bad recipe will make a better beer than the bad fermentation of a good recipe. Okay, and then boil, recipe, and finally water adjustment. Okay, so water adjustment is that last thing you worry about. When we talk about water, we're talking about the ions, that is the dissolved minerals in the water. And there's 2 groups of ions that affect our beer. Calcium, magnesium, and net total alkalinity, those affect our pH, the pH of the mash and the pH of the wort. Then there are the ions that affect flavor, and these are sulfate, chloride, and sodium. Okay, so we have the pH group and we have the flavor group. Next, I want to mention that in terms of concentration, anything from 0 to 50 ppm is a low concentration, all right? 50 to 100 ppm, that's a medium concentration. 100 to 150 ppm is high, and over 150 ppm, or parts per million, is a problem, okay? Most surface waters are low in dissolved minerals. All of your mineral concentrations will be less than 50 ppm. And mineral concentrations less than 50 ppm are usually not a problem. They're usually not worth worrying about. You can go ahead and add salts to your water to enhance flavors and adjust the pH without really worrying about what you're starting with. It's when you get into the medium and high, and especially the problem concentrations over 150 ppm of, say, alkalinity, that you've got to take much more drastic steps to adjust your water for brewing. Okay. So how does water affect beer flavor? Well, first we have the residual alkalinity of the water. This drives mash pH. The mash pH drives the beer pH, and the beer pH drives beer flavor expression. So it starts with the water, and it's the residual alkalinity of the water that drives the mash pH, and all that trickles down to our beer flavor expression, how those flavors are expressed to your palate. Now, within those flavors, we have the seasoning effects, and these are the seasoning balance from the sulfate and chloride in the water. More sulfate tends to make that beer character drier, makes the hop character more assertive. More chloride rounds out the malt character, makes it fuller and sweeter. Okay, so what we're playing with there is the balance of flavors. Are we going to accentuate the hoppy character, or are we going to accentuate the malty character by adjusting the sulfate and chloride? And I'll talk more about this as we go along. Lastly, we have the seasoning level. You know, the amount of seasoning, the amount of sulfate and chloride in the water. And this is represented by the total dissolved solids of the water. And it's important to understand that the total dissolved solids is in fact proportional to your calcium salt concentrations, because calcium salts are what we're adding to our water to affect the ion concentrations. So when we talk about seasoning level, total dissolved solids, it's proportional to your calcium salts. Okay, priorities as we adjust water. Mash pH is number one. Mash pH drives wort pH and wort composition, which drives fermentation. So mash pH is your number one goal when it comes to water adjustment. Okay. After you've got your mash pH dialed in, then we can look at flavor balance and structure. Flavor balance, of course, is the sulfate and chloride that we just talked about. And structure is the amount of sulfate and chloride. You know, how much structure, how much seasoning is in the water to enhance the beer flavors. Okay. When it comes to water adjustment, all of our recommendations are based on adjusting the water before we brew with it or as we're brewing with it. We don't have enough published data on, you know, beer mineral concentrations to say what's good and what's bad. We only really have water data and doing these adjustments up front. So, you know, post-fermentation adjustments to the beer can be done, but they really have to be done on a trial and error basis, adding a little bit of salts to enhance the hoppiness or so, doing some acid adjustments to help bring the pH down a little bit. All of this can be done, but it has to be done on a trial and error basis. Carbonated beer is highly buffered, so it takes more salts and more acids to adjust flavors in the beer than it does further upstream, say, as when we do it in the mash. So I just want to let you know that you can't, post-fermentation adjustment can be done, but it takes more to get the same effect. Okay, calcium loss during brewing. I know this, this came up earlier. Calcium is the most important mineral in the water. As brewers, we want to have at least 50 ppm, 50 parts per million. Another way of stating that is 50 milligrams per liter. We want to have at least 50 in our water. If not, if our water source doesn't contain calcium, then we need to add it in the form of calcium salts. Calcium enhances beer clarity, it enhances yeast flocculation, and it stabilizes the pH during the mash and the lauter. Okay. 50 is the recommended minimum. I feel that 100 ppm is a better number. Can't really go wrong with 100. Approximately half to 2/3 of the calcium will be lost by precipitation during the mash. It'll be precipitated out as calcium phosphate. And this is okay. This is the way it always happens. So you, as the brewer, may decide that you want to add more calcium at the kettle or even at the fermenter. That's going to be up to you, and you have to let taste be your guide, okay? But most of our additions are done for the purposes of stabilizing the mash, okay? Flavor stability in water. Package oxygen is the primary factor for flavor stability. How much oxygen gets into the bottle, gets into the can. 5 to 10 parts per billion is your target for package oxygen levels. From there, the next factors that govern flavor stability and staling are your temperature and time, your storage temperature. And it's important to know that 10 degrees Celsius changes the rate of chemical reactions by a factor of 2. So in terms of you package your beer and now you store your beer, at 40 degrees C, you really have only a matter of hours before that beer starts staling and those flavors start changing. At 30 degrees C, that number, that amount of time for staling drops down to a matter of days. 20 degrees C, now we're talking about a matter of weeks, maybe 6 weeks for good, till the flavor stability really starts to go. Down to 10 C, now we're talking a matter of months, maybe 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, depending on the beer style. And then if you get very cold, down to 0 degrees C, you may have as long as a year before that beer starts exhibiting signs of staleness. So, package oxygen is your #1 factor for flavor stability. Temperature and time come next. Water chemistry, which is, in this case, it is the pH effect. Is probably about a 10% factor at most. Higher pH is a less stable beer than a lower pH beer, okay? But that's probably about a 10% effect compared to oxygen, temperature, and time. Okay, the pH of the water is not important, and I want to emphasize that. pH of the water is not important. Water pH is a measure of the chemical equilibrium of the water and is the balance of hardness to alkalinity. And so a high pH, pH of 8 or 9, simply means there's more alkalinity than hardness in that balance. It doesn't say anything really about how much alkalinity and hardness there actually are. You can have 2 different waters that have the same water pH. So it's an indication of balance, but it really doesn't tell you how much. Okay. So you can have high mineral water, low mineral water, and they can have the same pH, but they will have a different mash pH, and that's due to the actual mineral concentrations that are in each of those waters. Okay, mash pH drives beer pH, and beer pH drives beer flavor. Okay, the effect of beer pH on flavor. In general, a lower beer pH focuses and brightens the malt and hop flavors. And by low beer pH, I have the example of, say, a beer pH of 4.2. As I'll show you in a minute, most beer pHs fall between 4 and 4.6. Okay, so if a beer pH of 4.2 represents one towards the low end, a little more acidic. And this is better for your single malt pale beers because a lower pH helps focus and brighten that malt character. Gives you some separation of the malt and hop characters in the beer. If your dark beer has a low beer pH of 4.2, a dark beer will exhibit some focusing of character as well. And you tend to end up with this singular kind of roast character, not a lot of complexity. It can still taste great, can still be a very good dark beer, but it won't have much complexity to it, okay? Now, if you brew that beer and are able to adjust its pH upward to say a beer pH of 4.5 or 4.6, that will do a lot to open up the malt flavors of that beer. And so if you've brewed a porter or a special export stout, we have lots of specialty malts. By raising that beer pH to 4.6, you'll open up those malt characters and be able to perceive each of the different specialty malts that are making up that beer. If the beer pH is too low, those tend to focus and leave you with kind of a singular roast character. Okay. Pale beers at high beer pH come across as overly dull and harsh. The bitterness tends to be harsher. Okay. And as I said, a lower beer pH tends to be more flavor stable than a high beer pH. And by high, in this case, I mean like 5. Okay. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about seasoning balance, sulfate and chloride. Sulfate and chloride affect the flavor balance of the beer, but they really are seasoning. You can't take a malty beer with a low amount of IBUs, add lots of sulfate to it to make it bitter and make it hoppy. It's just going to be dry. You can't create flavors that aren't there. All you can do is accentuate what is there. And it literally is the same as cooking and seasonings. Beer is food. Beer and brewing is food and cooking, okay? Can't create what's not there. So sulfate and chloride affect the dryness versus fullness, the hoppiness versus maltiness perception of the beer flavors. The ratio is a useful tool for describing this, but it's not magic. 40 to 10 doesn't taste the same as 400 to 100, okay? A useful range of sulfate to chloride ratio is anywhere from 9 to 1, although that's pretty extreme. To 4 to 1 is probably more typical, down to half to 1. That is, half to 1 being twice as much chloride as sulfate. And this is appropriate for your malty lagers as well as your New England IPAs. Maximum suggested sulfate is 500 ppm. Honestly, I find that 200 ppm is usually as high as I need to go, even for like a West Coast double IPA. Maximum suggested chloride is also 200 ppm, and that's pretty darn high. It's useful for New England IPAs where you're looking for very sweet, to bring out that sweet malty character, to balance, to give it that extra juiciness and so on, de-emphasize the hop bitterness. But when you go over 200, you start running into other issues from those concentrations. Okay. TDS effect, the total dissolved solids, what I call the mineral structure of the beer. This is light versus heavy seasoning. Let's look at these 3 beer styles. We have Bohemian Pilsner with a TDS of 50 ppm. And Bohemian Pilsner, Czech Pilsner, it's a a big beer, a robust beer, but it has a large, soft bitterness and a big, soft malt profile. The bitterness doesn't linger, okay? And that's due to the low mineral concentrations, no sharp edges. You look at German Pilsner, and there the Munich water typically has a TDS of around 150 ppm. Now we're looking at a little crisper beer, a little more hop forward beer, cleaner malt character, drier finish. This is a beer defined by some clean edges in terms of those flavor profiles. And then lastly, we have Dortmunder Export. Again, you know, we have Pilsner malt, lager yeast, noble hops, nearly identical recipes for these beers, but they taste different. And part of that taste difference is the waters they're made with. When you look at Dortmunder Export, it's actually a lower gravity beer than the other two styles, but it doesn't taste like it. And that's because it has all the minerals in the water that support the beer's flavors, okay? More structure to those flavors. Reverse osmosis water has had all of its minerals stripped out. And in other words, you are drinking a beer without seasoning. And it's just like, you know, eating food that has not been seasoned, wasn't cooked with any salt. The flavors are thinner. And typically when I judge beer in competitions, and I will come across beers that have been brewed with reverse osmosis water only, and the beer characters tend to be thin. The finish of those beers is a little watery, okay? So adding minerals to your reverse osmosis water helps give more structure to those flavors. Now, when you brew with reverse osmosis water, like I say, all the minerals are gone. There's no buffering in the water. And so pale beers tend to be higher pH and more bitter. Dark beers tend to be more acidic than what you would desire them to be. And so RO water can make good beer, and it often does, but it makes beer that could be better. That's my take home there. Adding minerals to reverse osmosis water can make a good beer better. Okay, let's talk a little bit about residual alkalinity. Residual alkalinity, if you haven't read How to Brew, it is the difference between the effects of the total alkalinity and hardness on mash pH. And you can see the equation there. Residual alkalinity equals total alkalinity minus the effect of the calcium and magnesium concentrations. Now, calcium and magnesium, otherwise known as water hardness, these elements react with malt phosphates to produce hydrogen ions according to the equation there below, down here. And in doing so, it releases these hydrogen ions into the wort, and that's what lowers the pH from the original water pH down, helps bring it down to our target pH of 5.2 to 5.6. And I'll talk more about pH here in a minute. Residual alkalinity, though, most natural waters have more alkalinity than hardness. So the residual alkalinity is usually a positive value. And what you can see here in this graph is the result of residual alkalinity measured in terms of parts per million as calcium carbonate, and its effect on mash pH. And let's look at the orange line with a water to grist ratio of 4 liters per kilogram. And you can see how a negative residual alkalinity, in other words, more hardness than alkalinity, has a lowering effect on mash pH. Takes it from 5.8 there at 0 down to about 5.7. But when you start increasing residual alkalinity from 50 ppm up to 225 ppm, you can see how that pH rises, the mash pH rises as you increase the residual alkalinity of the water. And what that is, that's actually the buffering effect of the carbonates, the bicarbonates in the water, inhibiting the release or absorbing, they're actually absorbing the release of those hydrogen ions that we talked about from the calcium and magnesium phosphates. Okay, that's residual alkalinity. So mash pH, therefore, is the equilibrium between the water chemistry, which is our residual alkalinity, and your malt chemistry. Okay. Now, our malts are either alkaline or acidic relative to our target mash pH, the target being 5.2 to 5.6. Base malts are generally alkaline. They have a distilled water pH of about 5.8. That's greater than our target range. Specialty malts are generally acidic. They have a distilled water mash pH of less than 5.2. Often that's down around 4.6. So they're acidic with respect to our targets. And so what the mash pH is, it's essentially balancing a triangle of our base malt alkalinity times its weight, our specialty malt acidity times its weight, and then our water's residual alkalinity times its volume. Balancing that triangle of these three factors is how we arrive at our mash pH. And that's a very important concept I want everyone to understand. You know, and when you're looking at your grain bill and your water profile, your residual alkalinity, understand how these three factors balance one another to arrive at your mash pH. Okay, what is the optimum pH? Well, it depends, because there are at least 30 different enzyme groups that are active in the mash during the mash. So it's basically like trying to herd cats. When you try to optimize the mash to optimize one parameter, such as yield or starch conversion or free amino nitrogen, you're really trying to herd all these cats in one direction. So when you talk about optimum pH, you have to say what it is you're trying to optimize. Now, generally, what we're trying to optimize is our yield. Okay, how much soluble extract we get from our malts, because that's money. Okay, but opinions differ on what those optimums may be. Here are three expert authors. Mr. Briggs and friends, Charlie Bamforth, and Wolfgang Kuntz. And Briggs says in Malting and Brewing Science that the best yield is between 5.2 and 5.4, but that was at mash pH or mash temperature. If you convert that to room temperature, that comes down to about 5.45 to 5.65. Bamforth measured it at 5.3 to 5.8, which converts to about 5.5 to 6.05 at room temperature. Kuntz measured it as 5.5 to 5.6 at 20 degrees C. So if you look at all of those together, we're thinking, okay, maybe the best yield is somewhere between 5.6 and 5.8. That's best yield. Anecdotally, we know as brewers that beer tends to taste better with a little lower pH. And that's how we get down to our 5.2 to 5.6 target range at room temperature. Now you may be asking yourself, okay, which of these authors is actually correct. And they're all correct, okay? This is real data from real experiments done in real laboratories by experts. It's important to understand that barley is an agricultural product, okay? It's grown all over the world. Different varieties have adapted to different growing seasons. These three gentlemen were each working on different continents. Briggs in the UK, Bamforth in the United States, and Kunze in Europe. I know the UK is not a continent, but anyway, you get my understanding. You know, barley's an agricultural product, and it has natural variation. So when it comes to trying to declare what the optimum pH is, that actually varies year to year, region to region. And it's important to realize that. Okay. Now, here's how mash pH sets up the beer pH. We start over here on the left with our 5.2 to 5.6 mash pH. And during the mash, that calcium phosphate reaction is still ongoing. So, you know, provided that you have enough calcium in your water, that reaction will proceed throughout the hour-long mash, and your mash pH can drop by about 0.2 by the end of the mash. Okay, now we go into the boil. During the boil, we're coagulating proteins, we're volatilizing gases, different chemical reactions are going on. pH tends to drop by about another 0.3. We go into fermentation. The yeast are taking up amino acids, they're excreting protons. Other biochemistry is going on. Carbon dioxide is being generated. pH tends to fall by another 0.5. So this is how we get from our mash pH down to our final beer pH of 4 to 4.6. These various reactions. And I want to emphasize that that measuring and tracking your pH throughout the brewing process is your best method for ensuring consistency of your beers batch to batch to batch. Because if you see the pH change, you know, in the process, you know something in your process has changed, whether it's an ingredient or an infection or what have you. The pH for each stage for a particular recipe should be consistent. Okay, effective beer pH on flavor. So let's go back to this. Every beer pH, every beer recipe has an optimum beer pH, generally in that 4 to 4.6 range. Every beer should have a flavor portfolio that includes malt flavors and aromas, hop flavors and aromas, and yeast flavors and aromas. If you're not tasting everything that you've put into that recipe, you're probably not at the optimum beer pH. So go back up to your mash, tweak that mash pH a little bit by 1/10 up or down, and find that sweet spot where all of your beer's flavors are being adequately expressed. That'll help you dial in your pH and your recipe. These are my suggested guidelines for mash pH. For pale beers, I recommend the lower end of that range, 5.2 to 5.4 for pale. For amber, more of the middle of the range, 5.3 to 5.5, and dark, the higher end of the range, 5.4 to 5.6. Always take a sample of wort from the mash and cool it down to room temperature or near room temperature before taking your pH measurement. All pH measurements are made with respect to room temperature. That's our gold standard. That's our baseline. Okay. Again, water pH is not important. Water pH is a measure of the equilibrium of the water. We're not worried about that. We're concerned with the equilibrium of the mash chemistry. So it's the mash pH that's important, and the wort pH that's important, and the beer pH that's important, not the water. If you adjust your water based on its pH, you're putting the cart before the horse. Don't do that. Okay, now here is the Brew Cube, and this is in the most recent edition of How to Brew, the one that was released in 2017. And what I want to show with the Brew Cube is how 3 beer factors relate to 3 water factors. So over on the left-hand side of the cube, we've got our beer flavor axis. Over here, malty, balanced, or hoppy. We have our beer color here on the side, pale, amber, or dark. And we have our beer structure, soft, medium, or firm. Okay. For our water parameters, we have our calcium level, 50, 100, and 150. Our residual alkalinity scale, -100, or for more acidic, 0 for equal, or +100 for more basic, more alkaline. Okay, and so these are general ranges, -100 to 0 to +100. And finally, we have our sulfate to chloride ratio. And for illustration purposes, I've put 4 to 1, 1 to 1, and half to 1. So what I want you to understand is that in terms of defining your beer style, we're talking about our beer flavor balance, malty, balanced, or hoppy, and that corresponds to the sulfate to chloride ratio. Okay. Our beer color, pale, amber, or dark, that corresponds to the water's residual alkalinity. Pale is -100, amber around 0, dark around +100. Our beer structure, soft, medium, or firm, light seasoning versus heavy seasoning, that corresponds to our calcium levels, 50, 100, or 150. Most beer styles fall in the soft to medium categories. Only a couple beer styles fall in that firm category, and those would be like London Ale, Burton Ale, or Dortmunder Export, something like that. Okay, most beer styles are going to be in the 50 to 100 range. Okay, so I think I have an example next. Oh, okay, next. Here's some suggested salt additions to reverse osmosis water in terms of grams per gallon. So if you want to brew a pale hoppy beer, we are going to, for pale beers, we want negative residual alkalinity. So we're just going to add hardness. We're not going to add any alkalinity. For hoppy, we'll work with more sulfate than chloride. So 1 gram per gallon of calcium sulfate and 1/2 gram per gallon of calcium chloride gives us this water profile here. Around 100 ppm of calcium, 150 sulfate, 64 chloride. That's roughly a 2 to 1 ratio, and a -70 residual alkalinity. If we want to go balanced, then we adjust equal amounts of sulfate and chloride, and that gives us this profile. Very similar. Sulfate and chloride around the same value, 111 to 96. Each of those is pretty close to 100, pretty balanced. For pale malty, we switch those around. We do half the calcium sulfate to 1 gram of calcium chloride, and that gets our sulfate to chloride of 75 versus 127. So not quite half to 1, but moving in that direction. Okay. Same thing with amber. Now we add 1/2 gram of baking soda per gallon of water. For dark beers, we increase that to 1 gram per gallon of baking soda, sodium bicarbonate. And again, we keep our calcium levels about the same, around 100. Same sulfate to chloride. All we're doing is changing the residual alkalinity to near 0 and near positive 100. I wanted to show you this. Oops, where'd that go? I wanted to show you how simple water adjustment can be. It doesn't have to be very complicated. Okay, moving on. Here's some mini mash results that we did at a conference a year or so ago, using 3 simple grain bills. Pale would be base malt only, amber was base malt plus 10% crystal, dark was base with the 10% crystal and then 10% roast. Going from pale, amber, and dark waters profiles, or sorry, that's the malt profile. Pale hoppy, pale malty, amber malty, and dark malty water profiles that you just saw on the previous slide. You can see the changes in pH as a result of grain bill and as a result of increasing residual alkalinity. So kind of substantiates the effects I was talking about. So how do I adjust water for style? So here's an example. This is my water here in Los Angeles. Our water here has 40 ppm of calcium, 10 ppm of magnesium, 120 ppm of alkalinity. Sulfate and chloride are low concentrations as well, around 40, and as well as the sodium around 30. Residual alkalinity is positive 86. Okay, so if you would look at this water profile in terms of the cube, you would say that this would be a soft, dark, and balanced water profile. Okay, the flavor structure is soft, the beer color indicated is dark, and the flavor balance is balanced based on the sulfate to chloride ratio. They're nearly 1-to-1. Okay. So when I look at this water, I say, okay, I need more calcium. I've got a requirement for 50 ppm minimum. This only has 40. So I'm going to add calcium salts to increase that. Now let's say that I want to brew a nice pale ale, hoppy pale ale with this water. For my calcium addition, therefore I'm going to use calcium sulfate and add more sulfate to this water. So I'm gonna shoot for pale hoppy medium, and I'm gonna increase my calcium level up to 100 ppm. In doing so, that raised my sulfate from 40 up to 187 ppm, and it kept everything else the same because I only added calcium sulfate. My residual alkalinity dropped from 86 down to 42. Okay, that's an improvement, but it's not the negative residual alkalinity that I really am shooting for when I'm trying to brew a pale beer. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to neutralize some of this residual alkalinity with acid. Now, if I was trying to brew a dark beer, for instance, instead, then I could add sodium bicarbonate to this profile, but I'm trying to brew a pale beer, so I'm going to add lactic acid, and this 0.75 milliliters per gallon was calculated off the water app that I showed you earlier. So the water app will guide you through and help you calculate just how much acid is required to do this. Doing this acid addition brings our residual alkalinity down to -75, which is a good number for a pale beer. Okay, So my first step was to look at my calcium and adjust my calcium, and then from there look at my residual alkalinity, see what that turned out to be, take further steps on the residual alkalinity with an acid addition, and that brings our end water profile to this. And we have a water for this beer. Okay, so in terms of building this adjusted water, first I'm going to acidify to neutralize this alkalinity, and then add calcium salts. And then I'll do a proportional mini mash to verify that those additions have achieved my target mash pH. Question that often comes up is, when do I add salts? Well, like I said earlier, your first priority is achieving your target mash pH. That's number one. So to do that, you can add all of your salt adjustments and acid adjustments to your hot liquor tank, and then just brew with that water. Or if you are in a production brewery where you're doing more than one brew a day, you may be filling and draining that HLT. You may want to do your salt and acid additions right at the mash tun. Once you've got that volume of water in your mash tun filled and are about to dough in, that's when you would add your salts and acid. Because now you've got a discrete volume, a consistent volume of water to add them to. Okay. Once you've achieved your target mash pH, your second priority is then achieving flavor balance and structure. Now, sparging. If you're sparging with reverse osmosis water, you really don't need to do much. Reverse osmosis water doesn't have alkalinity, which would change the mash pH very much. You may want to do some acidification of that sparge water anyway to help maintain your runnings pH and avoiding having that pH rise. And once your mash and lauter is done, you can add any additional salts or acid that you want to the kettle to do any further flavor adjustments. But first priority was getting that mash pH right. Once you've done that, look at the sparge. Do you need to do anything for the sparge to maintain that pH range? If not, go on to the kettle and do any flavor adjustments you want there. People ask, how do I know how much acid to add to neutralize alkalinity? I explain this in How to Brew and in the water book, but basically what you're doing is you're dividing your total alkalinity number by 50 to get milliequivalents per liter. And then you can add that number in terms of acid milliequivalent, per liter of your mash to neutralize that alkalinity. Okay, pretty easy calculation. Both my Brewing Water spreadsheet and the Brewing Water app do this calculation for you and give you a number in terms of milliliters of acid to add based on your total water volume. Okay, so for adding alkalinity to brew dark beers, low mineral water needs alkalinity to buffer the acidity of the dark malts. So sodium bicarbonate, baking soda, works better than calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate does not dissolve in water. It will dissolve in the mash, but it still needs to chemically react in the mash to convert from carbonate to bicarbonate to dissolved carbon dioxide. And that reaction can take a couple of hours. Okay, it takes longer to affect mash pH than you're actually mashing for. So calcium carbonate is not recommended. Sodium bicarbonate works, and calcium hydroxide along with sodium hydroxide also work to raise mash pH. Okay. 50 to 75 ppm as calcium carbonate alkalinity is needed for your red and brown beers, 75 to 125 ppm for your brown to black beers. Again, mash pH target that I recommend for dark beers are generally 5.4 to 5.6. Adjusting sparge water, your target mash pH is your first priority. After that, the next priority is to make sure that the pH doesn't rise above 5.8 or 6 as you're sparging, because once you get above 6, now you start extracting tannins and silicates from your husks that give beer lots of astringency. Okay, so if you're brewing with RO water, you probably don't have to do much acidification because it doesn't have the alkalinity that would raise mash pH. Excuse me, I'm talking too much. Okay, options for acidifying sparge water. You can use your adjusted HLT water to sparge with. That's probably your first recommendation. Second is to use RO to sparge with, and then add in the additional salts you need for flavor adjustment to the kettle after the sparge. If you only have high alkalinity water to sparge with, then I recommend acidifying it using the calculations in the water app. Brewing sour beers, water adjustment for sour beers. Okay, well, you're still making wort. The mash pH still needs to be 5.2 to 5.6. Okay, doesn't matter if you're doing a pale sour beer or a dark sour beer, you're still looking at that 5.2 to 5.6 range with all my previous recommendations that we talked about. Souring happens on the cold side after you've made your wort. Okay, so in terms of water adjustment for sour beers, well, let's think about the kinds of flavors we're looking for in that sour beer. Generally, we want a soft, pleasant sourness. We don't want anything harsh. So I recommend low mineral water for sour beers because the more structure, and especially the more sulfate you have, the drier that beer is going to be, the more aggressive that sourness will be, especially when you get into high mineral water. You could end up with a very dry, somewhat harsh sourness. So I recommend low minerals overall and low sulfate for sour beers. And low again means that all mineral concentrations are at 50 ppm or less. The exception is calcium, which should still be in that 50 to 75, maybe even up to 100 ppm range, because calcium gives good beer clarity and it helps your yeast flocculation and lots of other beer brewing parameters. So low minerals overall, but keep your calcium up. So in summary, adjust your water to achieve good mash pH, adjust your water to adjust your beer seasoning, and remember, brewing is cooking. Don't oversalt, but don't be afraid to adjust it to your taste. Now I've got, I think, 3 slides dealing with RO, and so let's go through these real quick. Source water cleanliness has a big impact on the longevity of your reverse osmosis cartridges, okay? Typical flow rates you should be able to achieve with reverse osmosis. If it's a surface water source, there tends to be some biofouling in surface water sources. So the best you're going to look do is about 8 to 14 gallons per square foot of membrane per day. For groundwater sources, usually higher mineral load, but less biofouling, and you may be able to get 14 to 18 gallons per square foot of membrane per day. Oops, next slide. I didn't remember doing this. Okay, membrane degradation. Hydrolysis caused by too high or too low pH, and I'm talking outside of normal water pHs, you know, acidic like 3 to 4, alkaline, you know, 9, 10, or 11. Those are the extremes. Oxidation due to chlorine, hydrogen peroxide, or potassium permanganate. And then there's mechanical damage as well. And this could be pressure damage from overpressurizing the membranes. Then we have precipitation deposits. We have calcium scale buildup from your calcium carbonate. We have sulfate scale buildup from your calcium sulfate, barium sulfate, and strontium sulfate. Or is it cerium? I forget. Also, you can get silica scale, silicates, SiO2. Those can block your membranes and cause fouling problems. And finally, we have colloidal deposition, and this is your biofouling, your algae, fungus, molds, and bacteria that can plug your membranes, as well as plain old silt. Rejection rates. I'm learning this as myself these last couple days, so I'm not an expert here. The industry standard test conditions is 60 psi at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which translates to 414 kilopascals at 25 degrees Celsius. Your rejection rate for the membrane should be 96% or greater. Okay, now what is this rejection rate? Well, this is the total dissolved solids. And so you want a membrane to be able to reject 96% of the total dissolved solids or better. Okay, so for example, if the TDS of your feed water, your source water, is 450 parts per million, you want to reject 96% of that, and then the TDS of your permeate or your resultant brewing water, the TDS of that water should only be 18 parts per million. In other words, 4% of the total TDS. TDS is usually measured by electrical conductivity, and then that's converted by a coefficient that depends on the nature of the TDS, and different regions can have different coefficients. But those are generally programmed into handheld TDS meters that you can buy on Amazon and elsewhere for like $100 to $200. Temperature and pressure effects on the membranes. Every 100 parts per million of total dissolved solids will require 1 psi increase in pressure to maintain the same flow rate through that membrane. And of course, as you increase the TDS of the feed water, the TDS of your permeate water will increase proportionally because it is a percentage. Okay. Now, a 1 degree Celsius change in temperature from our baseline of 25 degrees Celsius will cause a 5% change in flow rate. Colder water flows slower than warmer water. So as your source water temperature decreases, your flow rates will decrease. As your source water temperatures increase, your flow rates will increase. One troubleshooting aspect to look for is if your pressure drop from your feed water to your reject water, that is your brine, is if that pressure drop is greater than 15%, then the membrane has probably become clogged and needs to be cleaned. Okay. Finally, I'm giving you one slide on alkaline drinking water. Alkalized water, alkaline drinking water that's popular. It's all hype. Alkaline water by definition has a pH greater than 7, and that's literally most of the drinking water in the world has a pH greater than 7. Alkalinity by definition is the amount of bicarbonate buffer in the water. For example, this is where we get our number total alkalinity is calcium carbonate. That is a measure of alkalinity, how much buffering power is in the water. And pH and alkalinity have the same relationship as temperature versus heat. Okay, so for example, a small cinder can be very hot, 240 degrees Celsius, but it's so small it only contains a small amount of heat, and if you drop it on your hand, it would hurt for a moment, but then it would go away. Whereas if you had a liter of hot water that was only 80 degrees Celsius, but you stuck your hand in it, you would get burned very badly. Okay, it's the difference between temperature and heat. So it's the same as pH and alkalinity. It goes back to the same thing where you can have a low mineral water and a high mineral water with the same water pH, but vastly different amounts of alkalinity in that water. Okay. All right, that's the end of my presentation. Hope I answered some questions, and I'll be happy to answer any more.
Okay, thank you very much, John. That's a very informative presentation there. A lot to take in.
Thank you.
So we got quite a few questions lined up for you.
Good.
Let's start with, so for Benito, what will the effect in beer taste be if you use DI water instead of RO water?
Minimal. DI water is simply ultra pure RO water. RO water will have less than 10 ppm of minerals in it left over. Your TDS, like I said in that example, was maybe 18. That is the sum total of all the ions in solution. So you have 2, 3, 5 ppm of different ions in RO water. Distilled water or deionized water has gotten closer to 0, so maybe 1 ppm maximum of each of these ions. Very negligible difference between the two in terms of taste, in terms of brewing. They will brew exactly the same.
Okay. Can you adjust your mash pH after the boil and add other minerals?
Well, you can't adjust the mash pH because the mash has already happened after the boil. So you can adjust your wort pH, yes, after the boil. It's hard to say exactly what you'd want to adjust it to. Going by that one graphic I showed you, how the pH has generally dropped from our mash pH range of 5.2 to 5.6 by that 0.2 and by that 0.3. Yeah, we'd be looking at like a half pH lower target range after the boil. And yes, you can do some acid additions to lower that, or you could do some bicarbonates, like sodium bicarbonate additions, or a strong base like the hydroxide. You could do those kind of additions to the wort to change its pH at that point if you felt you needed to. And you would have to, again, let beer taste be your guide. You're going to have to work back and forth a couple of times to find out just how much change you want.
Okay. What are the benefits of adding magnesium to light colored beers? We add it to our dark beers, but ignore it in our light beers.
Yeah, I don't know is the best answer I can give you. I know based on my co-author's experience that he felt that magnesium enhanced the flavor of dark beers. I don't know that it has an enhancement effect on pale beers. Okay, so sorry.
Yeah, so he was saying here he has approximately 5 ppm in their groundwater.
Yeah, that's a low concentration. Even if you kick that up to say 15 or 20 ppm, I don't know that you would have a flavor effect. Most ions at less than 50 ppm, that's kind of 50 ppm is kind of the threshold we use to talk about flavor effects. So I don't know that you'd actually experience much, by upping your magnesium in pale beers. In dark, it apparently has some effect, but hard to quantify.
Okay. You got another one. You're probably tired of hearing it, but what ideal water chemistry do you recommend for brewing a New England IPA,
Okay.
particularly chloride sulfite ratio and concentration?
Okay. Yeah, sulfate to chloride ratio. I like the 1/2 to 1 or the twice as much chloride as sulfate for New England IPA. Chloride enhances that juiciness character that we're looking for, that sweetness from the malt. And so going back to my general recommendations, I recommend about 200 ppm of chloride maximum. When I do New England IPAs myself, I'm usually working around 150 ppm of chloride and maybe 50 to 75 ppm of sulfate. Calcium can be anywhere, 50 to 100.
Okay. Can we say 5.2 to 5.3 is the best mash pH regardless of any particular style in general?
No.
Simple answer there.
Yeah, not really. Again, going back to my earlier slide, optimum pH is a bit of a fuzzy target because we are talking about barley, an agricultural product. That being said, I think 5.2 to 5.3 to 5.4 works best for pale beers, but I think you get much better flavor expression from a dark beer when that mash pH is higher, around 5.4 to 5.6. So yeah, his question, 5.2 to 5.3 for all beers, no.
Okay. Zinc is usually recommended for yeast vitality and better fermentation. How can you add this sulfite to mash, and does this affect mash pH?
Okay. Sulfate and sulfite actually
Sorry,
do
sulfate.
not affect pH. The sulfates are not a strong enough anion to affect pH. So, and the zinc doesn't, undergo any reactions in the mash that affect pH. So, you can make these zinc additions without affecting mash pH.
Okay. In Greg Noonan's book, it's stated that potassium above 150 ppm can inhibit enzyme activity, yet finished beer can have potassium up in the hundreds to thousands. Can you tell us more about this?
I don't know. On what basis Greg Noonan was saying that potassium inhibited enzyme reactions. I don't know where that's coming from. But it is true that malt contains a lot of potassium, somewhere in the order of 200 ppm, depending on, and again, this goes back to the barley and the region it was malted, and so on and so on. You know, there's a lot of variation there. Malt also contains lots of chloride. So even though we talk about, for example, 150 ppm of chloride maximum to have in your water, the malt is actually going to add like 200 ppm or 300 ppm, depending on its source. So the same situation goes with potassium. There can be a lot of potassium in the malt, and the beer will end up having a fair amount of potassium in it. Again, we just don't have enough published information, enough published studies on the effects of these ions in the final beer and what they do.
Okay. When we talk about when we talk about residual alkalinity influencing color, how big is this effect? And are we talking about a whole EBC or in lower levels?
Maybe a whole EBC, but it is a small effect. Higher pH, higher residual alkalinity, and again, there's a connection between higher residual alkalinity causing higher wort pH, but it's not a linear relationship. So we're talking trends. Higher pH tends to encourage wort darkening via Maillard reactions. Maillard reactions are more active at higher pH. So that's where this color change comes from. In terms of adjusting water and adjusting residual alkalinity based on beer style and beer color, that relationship is different. What we're doing there is we're trying to quantify how much acidity the specialty malts of that particular grain bill has, and balance that with the alkalinity of the water, so we still come to our 5.2 to 5.6 target mash range. That's what we're trying to do there.
Okay. And are you recommending sodium bicarbonate or baking soda over slaked lime or lye?
I think in general, yes, I am. The sodium bicarbonate is a pretty natural occurrence in water. So, you know, in terms of an addition that mimics nature, you know, we're not really changing much in terms of flavor, you know, potential beer flavor. It is non-hazardous. Hydroxides can be hazardous. Sodium hydroxide. Calcium hydroxide, pickling lime, slaked lime, is very effective for adjusting pH, but it is a little bit more hazardous to handle, can be a little bit harder to obtain. And some people have reported that using calcium hydroxide or slaked lime tends to impart a slight chemical flavor to the beer. I haven't tasted that, but that's been some of the feedback I've gotten.
Okay. If we have a pH meter with ATC probe, do we still have to wait to cool our wort to room temperature before measuring the wort pH?
Yes, very good question. Automatic temperature compensation, ATC, what that does is it keeps the meter calibrated at temperatures other than the calibration temperature. When you go into the lab or you go into the brewery, you know, during the day, you turn on your pH meter, you calibrate your pH meter at room temperature in the buffer solutions. Now that pH meter is calibrated at room temperature. If you go to measure a sample that's not at room temperature, say wort, that may be at say 35, 40 degrees Celsius, as opposed to 25, the ATC functions reads that temperature and says, okay, I'm actually at this distance from my calibration temperature. I'm going to adjust my response to give you the real pH at this different temperature. That's what it's doing. It compensates for the meter, but it doesn't compensate for the actual change in solution pH due to temperature changes. pH is a measure of chemical activity, and chemical activity of a solution changes with temperature. So that's why we always talk about wort and beer pH with respect to room temperature, because that way we're always comparing apples to apples. We're standardizing room temperature as this zone where we're quantifying the chemical activity at that temperature, just for the basis of comparison.
Okay, great. What are your thoughts on acidifying sparge water?
Acidifying sparge water is often necessary if you're trying to actively manage your wort pH to prevent astringency. And here in the United States, a lot of us are brewing with groundwater. The United States sits on large pockets of limestone, and we can actually have very high alkalinity in our water that would raise the wort pH during the sparge if we weren't acidifying that sparge water to neutralize that alkalinity. Elsewhere, if you're brewing with surface water sources with low alkalinity, or if you're brewing with reverse osmosis water with no alkalinity, you may not have to acidify your sparge water at all. Depends on your beer and your recipe and your equipment, etc. Measure your pH of your runnings and of your final wort and see what those numbers are. You may not have to do any acidification.
Okay. Many brewers in Southeast Asia use RO water. So my prime reason for using it, other than potability, was that the water source could change drastically from one day to another, making it impossible to achieve consistency.
Right.
What advantages could be gained from blending filtered and RO water? And are they worth the investment in manpower and machinery to do so?
Well, your advantages to blending RO with filtered water, or blending RO with some of the some of the brine, to put back some minerals, is to get back some of this mineral structure that I talked about. That give the beer flavors some structure. But you can easily do that with brewing salts, with calcium, pure calcium salts, calcium sulfate, calcium chloride, sodium bicarbonate. You can easily make salt additions to take care of that. So really, it becomes a question of economics. How expensive is this RO water system? How much water, how much brine are you throwing away, to get the quantities of RO water that you need to brew with? Economically, is it necessary to reduce the purity of your RO by blending to save money? Those are the kind of considerations I would look at to answer that question. Generally, I would say that if your water costs are low and you can achieve consistent, day-to-day consistency with pure RO water, and then just adding calcium salts, I think that's the preferred way to do it.
Okay. We've got multiple questions here. So if we increase calcium in the water, then TDS will increase. Are there any ions that can affect this value?
All of them do. TDS, total dissolved solids, that's all the ions in the water. So, the 6 main ions in water are calcium, magnesium, bicarbonate, sodium, chloride, and sulfate. Those are the big 6. They account for 99% of the ions in water. Then you also have iron, manganese, silica, and others that can be in there. And then you have your organic contaminants as well. So all of these things contribute to TDS, but the 99% of them are those 6: calcium, magnesium, sulfates, chloride, sodium, etc. Those are those. So yeah, when you add calcium salts, you are affecting the TDS substantially. But I think these others are just trace elements, and they're really not worth worrying about, unless it's something like iron, where you can taste that iron in the water as a perceptible contaminant.
Okay. We've got time for a few more questions, so please don't send any more questions through. We got 9 lined up here, so we run through them quickly. So are there any notes on formation of carbonic acid in RO water and its effect on sparging?
Okay, carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is mostly dissolved aqueous carbon dioxide. I think it's only like 1.7% of the dissolved carbon dioxide in the water actually converts to carbonic acid. And yes, if you create RO water, it will absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and its pH will drop from 7, which is distilled water, down to like 5.2. And that's due to the carbon dioxide, the carbonic acid. But there's very, very little buffering, very little alkalinity potential in that water. If you add a couple drops of acid, its pH will shoot way down. Or if you add some sodium bicarbonate to that RO water, its pH will shoot right back up. There's really not much buffering in RO water with carbon dioxide in it. Normal amounts of atmospheric carbon dioxide.
Okay. Anything extra to look out for in the budget methods of doing NA or low alcohol beer with regards to arrested fermentation, maltose, negative yeast, wort low in maltose, or multi-trios?
I'm really not an expert in that area. I really don't have much to say out there.
Okay. We'll move on then. Will there be any effect if you adjust your minerals after fermentation to do with the final flavoring? Will there be a big effect?
It takes more because your beer has a fair amount of buffering at that point. All the different organic compounds, from the malt and so on in the water. Generally, I find that you have to add more salts to the beer than you would have to the mash to get the same amount of flavor change. Yes, you can do it, and it's perfectly valid to take a glass of beer and take an eyedropper with like a calcium sulfate solution, and do eyedropper drops into that beer and swirl it and taste it, and you'll get that flavor change. That hop character will become a little bit more assertive. The beer character will become a little drier with those calcium sulfate additions. But you may find that it takes like 150 ppm of sulfate to achieve that flavor change in the final beer, versus say maybe only 100 ppm in the mash.
Okay.
So there's that effect.
Yeah, so that's kind of, I guess that answers the next question. What's your opinion on post-fermentation pH adjustments to New England IPAs after massive dry hops?
Yeah, dry hopping raises pH. You know, you'll see it rise up to like 4.6, 4.8. Yeah, I think doing some acid additions, whether it's phosphoric or lactic, or maybe even hydrochloric, um, to bring that pH back down, you know, to the more 4.2, 4.4-ish, I think that has a big effect on enhancing that fruity, juicy character of a New England IPA. Um, yeah, it's definitely doable.
Okay. Do sulfites contribute to lingering bitterness?
No, actually, sulfates prevent lingering bitterness. High sulfate, the hop character of a beer with a high sulfate character, depending on that how much, it's drier. It's aggressive. It hits your tongue faster, but it also fades faster. It's when you have low sulfate water that hop character tends to build, that bitter character tends to build up on your tongue and linger. More sulfate tends to make that bitterness fade faster.
Okay. Do you recommend any other acids for adjusting mash pH besides lactic acid? And is citric acid okay?
Citric acid is okay. It has a lower flavor threshold than lactic, so depending on the type of beer you're brewing, you may start getting that citrus, you know, tang to the beer. I think in a New England IPA it would be fine because you're going for that kind of character anyway. Um, Other beers such as a Pilsner or so on, you may not want that kind of citrus tang from citric acid. I think lactic or phosphoric are better choices there.
Okay. What is the best mineral addition to neutralize chloramine that is added in the water supply?
Sodium metabisulfite or potassium metabisulfite. The metabisulfite reacts with the chloramine to produce chlorides and sulfate, which are, you know, in your water anyway. And because the amount of chloramine is actually quite small, it's a negligible amount of additional chloride and additional sulfate. It's like 10 ppm. It's not worth worrying about.
Okay. And Colin Kaminsky commented how he scaled down on his water adjustments after writing the water book with you.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, has your opinion and brewing practice on water changed significantly?
I wouldn't say it's changed significantly. I do tend to be a little more measured with my water adjustments, and you know, like I said, you know, we initially recommended up to 500 ppm of sulfate for a hoppy, you know, IPA. But these days, no, I'm doing like maybe 200 ppm, you know, for sulfate. I think that's perfectly adequate. 500 gets pretty darn dry. Um, but still, I think the basic tenets of the water book, you know, adjusting mash pH is your first priority, and adjusting mash pH depending on style. Like I talked about, low end for pale, higher end of the target range for dark. I think that has some very, you know, award-winning results for your beers. Being able to fine tune that pH can really open up the flavors of your beer. Make
So
a
it's really
good beer great.
a fine tuning
Yes,
device.
fine tuning. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And the last question is, what's that painting hanging over your router?
Oh, right there. Um, it's uh, it's a picture of a rainy street by a Russian artist that my wife liked. So it's a palette knife painting, impressionism.
Nice, very nice.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, John. Really appreciate
Thank you.
the time you've taken to come and talk with us today.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I really appreciate you inviting me. Thanks, Charles.
Thanks, Rose. Thanks a lot. And yeah, I'm sure, thank everybody for joining us as well. And we look forward to catching up with everyone soon once once all this is over, and to
Very
our
good.
next technical session next week. So thank you very much, John. Thanks once again. A pleasure having you online with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good.
Good night.
Thank you very much. See you soon.